Hello everyone, Michael Chamblin here. If you follow this channel for a while, you know that I love time-lapse photography. I love incorporating time-lapse into my video projects, and I'm going to share with you a few tricks and tips that I've learned over the years that's going to help you to produce better time-lapses. Just to start this out, time-lapse is so accessible now that, even on your cell phone you can shoot a pretty good time-lapse. So it's not necessarily about the gear, but there is one piece of gear you might consider if you're getting started with time-lapse and your camera does not have a built-in intervalometer. Alright, this is an intervalometer or a camera trigger release, and this allows the camera to take pictures over time at a set interval. So I could set this to every 1 second, and for every time this clicks, it's going to click a photo. It's very simple, very basic, and I think you can buy these on Amazon for about 15, 20 bucks. Personally, I buy the cheap ones. They have name brand ones that are like $200 or $300. These usually work out well. Sometimes they break. If you buy 2 of them, it's still only like 40 bucks or even less. One thing I like to do, put a little bit of Velcro on the back so that you can attach it to a tripod. But this is what you're going to use to trigger the camera if your camera does not have a built-in trigger release. So tip number 1 is understanding your interval. What your interval needs to be to get the best possible motion. Now, a lot of people think when they first get started with time-lapse, if you run the longest possible shot, that's going to give you the best possible motion. It might give you the most motion, but it's not going to be the best. Sometimes slowing that camera down and taking very quick intervals is going to be your best option. Some of my favorite time-lapses I've only run for maybe 6 to 7 minutes, where people look at the footage and think that it's actually been shot for about an hour. So understanding your interval is important, and the best tip I can give you is the quicker something is moving, generally the faster you want your interval to be. So if you're shooting cars and people moving around the streets, you might consider a 1 second interval so that that camera clicks every 1 second. And you only have to run the shot for 5 or 6 minutes to get enough photos to produce a nice time lapse. But slower moving objects like the Milky Way, you're going to want a 20 to 30 second interval so that you can actually see the movement of the stars since they're moving so slowly. So just understanding your interval based on the subject that you want to show is very important, and it's going to produce the best possible results for you. Tip number 2 is to always shoot in RAW. Now, this is going to produce a whole lot of data. You're going to need some fast memory cards and some extra hard drive space, but if you want to edit your time lapses and get the best possible quality, I always recommend shooting RAW for your time lapses. That's what I do every single time, regardless of what I'm shooting, because I know in Lightroom or in Photoshop or in another editing software, I'm going to be able to want to process those time lapses same as you would with photography. You'd shoot in RAW so that you can process the photo afterwards. Tip number 3 is to shoot slight long exposures to blur out your subject. Now, when you do super short exposures, you can get this thing called the staccato effect, and it makes things look a little choppy. It makes the motion look choppy. When you see a car go boom, 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 and it's very still, it looks choppy. It's like stop motion. But you add a little bit of motion blur onto that car, and suddenly it feels as though it's zooming through the frame. Now, if you're trying to produce tilt shift shots and you want to make things look like little miniature objects, it might be good to shoot a quicker shutter speed. But for most time-lapse, to get the smoothest possible motion, you want a little bit of motion blur in there, especially if you're shooting something like water. The other benefit to shooting a slight long exposure is that if you have any birds moving through the frame, it's going to blur out the birds and you won't have to clone them out later, which is really annoying, and you don't want to do that. I can't tell you how much time I've sat in front of the computer cloning out birds. So any possible way of avoiding that, I'm always going to choose to do. Now, of course, if you're shooting during the day, you can't knock that shutter speed down too far without something like a filter. So here's one of the filters I use. This one is, I believe, a 6-stop filter. If I'm shooting anything during sunset, I usually use a 6-stop. That's enough to knock down my shutter speed, get like half a second. If I'm shooting in broad daylight, just like midday light, I'll use a 10-stop filter to really knock that down. Tip number 4 is to shoot the time lapses in manual. Now, I know what you're thinking, but what about when the city lights are turning on and you're going from day to night? That is an exception, and for that you might consider a different alternative method like using aperture priority mode, but you're going to run into issues where you have to fix all the flicker that's going to go on in the shots as that exposure changes and as the light meter tries to compensate. You're going to see inconsistencies in the exposure that you're going to need to smooth out with a program like LR Timelapse. And it can be a little bit advanced to learn. So if you're getting started, I recommend shooting all your time lapses on manual. If you're shooting sunset, overexpose the frame a little bit just to the point where you're clipping the highlights and let the exposure fall into place during the time lapse, or vice versa if you're shooting a sunrise. I will say about 90% of my time lapses, maybe even more, are shot in manual. So using the aperture priority mode method really is only good, in my opinion, for long-term lighting changes like day to night shots. And to be honest, I don't do those that often. Most of the time, it's on manual. Another quick tip, just make sure autofocus is off. Simple as that. It can ruin your shot. You can get a little bit of a focus shift in between frames, and you don't want that. So easy enough to just make sure it's on manual. All right, my biggest tip is not a technical one, but I think it's the most important, and it's just to get out there, practice, 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 and express your creativity. Try unique ideas. It might not work out, but there's no harm in trying. Try different intervals, try different subject matter. Don't just focus on one thing to time lapse. Really just play around and experiment, because some of my favorite time lapses I've ever done, there was a lot of uncertainty of if they were going to work out, and it was merely just an experiment. But those ended up being the ones that were my favorites. So get out there, have fun, shoot time lapse. If you haven't already, subscribe to the channel. I really appreciate you watching this video. I'll be putting out more tutorials, tricks and tips, and a new vlog series in Oregon with Gavin, aka Photo Tripper, where we chase the Milky Way. And I think we're also releasing a pretty awesome Milky Way course as well. So I'll catch you in the next one. Sounded pretty good. Oh yeah. Tip number 2. What's tip number 2? Tip number 2. Why can't I remember tip number 2? I should have written all this down. How many tips did I do? I'll catch you in the next one. Camera transition. Oh boy.